Hi all, so in this segment we're going to look at various effects that cause change in allele frequencies. So we've already spent some time really looking at the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and looking at population genetics and how we can calculate those changes. So let's look at some of the ways in which those changes can actually occur. So obviously the big one we've talked about, is natural selection. So in this, there's a few ways that natural selection can actually work on a population. One is directional selection, okay, and which we're going to look at a few graph options. Directional selection is right here, okay? I have variation in my population, and due to natural selection and the selection against a particular phenotype, in this case a lighter colored butterfly, okay, those are getting selected against. I take you back to one of our first worksheets where we really looked at the flies and their wing length, so you might want to peek at that. Can be a great reference for this. So we have this area being selected against. So over time, what happens is if I go back multiple generations later and sample my butterflies, my curve and my change in the amount of traits that I'm seeing has moved. So the curve, which had sort of a more midline here, is now over here. So there's been actual shift in what we see, and we've lost the lighter colored ones. So there's actually been a decrease in the variation that actually exists. Another one is called stabilizing, and in stabilizing selection we actually lose our extremes, and this would be like on the worksheet, this would be the one where we had the wind blowing the long flies out, and this would also be like where we had the critter that was eating the short-winged flies, leaving us only with the intermediates. So in this case, we're actually selecting against our extreme types of variations, leaving us with the higher numbers of those. And this is why we call it stabilizing, but it does reduce the variation, and it actually limits the amount of differences that we have in that population itself. And the last one's called disruptive selection. And in disruptive selection, we're taking out the intermediates. And in disruptive selection, where we lose sort of our midline getting selected against, you can see that over time, I'm actually increasing the numbers of my extremes, losing this area, so I don't have any in here. And what this does is actually separates my groups. And this kind of selection is what can ultimately lead to speciation, which we'll be getting to. So could I create new species? Could I separate these two groups enough where I actually wouldn't have any actual breeding with them anymore? Now, mutations are another way that change can happen. So you get an inherited genotype that actually alters the traits that you have. Now, these are pretty low-key because, one, they're very rare, they're very random. Most mutations, believe it or not, are actually neutral, and if they're not neutral, they're usually bad news, because we know that changing the gene changes the protein outcome, and that can really mess with things, especially if it's an enzyme or something like that. But believe it or not, a lot of the mutations we have are random, and they are neutral, and we don't even know that they've happened. So the types of mutations, just to remind ourselves a little bit of what there are, we have the deletion, duplication, inversion, translocation, substitution. All of these shifts and changes to the DNA can cause change, especially if it then gets passed on to the next generation, because remember, that's the key. If I mutate, not really a big deal if I don't pass it down to the next generation. So causes of mutations, though, we've spent some time talking about. We know that there's radiation that can cause mutation. Chemicals can cause mutation. All types of things. So we've spent some time discussing those errors in replication. However, the thing about this is that the rate is really low. Mutations are ultra rare. So that rate is based on environmental factors. So other factors that are going to influence change as well are gene flow, and we're going to actually look at this in the lab as well and have a little fun lab looking at this. Migration, if organisms leave, if groups splinter from other groups, that's going to cause change. And it could be not just the individual, but gamete migration, right? Because if you get the gamete far away, then that's going to happen too. So, like pollen, pollen gets spread through the wind, through animals. It's one of the ways that it helps promote its variation. And sometimes this can counteract natural selection because it isn't something that maybe necessarily nature's actually selecting for. It's actually something that you might find, is unintentional in essence. So let's look at a couple of options there. So genetic drift is one. This is where we get a change in the gene pool due completely by chance. A group of organisms gets on a boat and winds up at this weird island, and some of the individuals get off. That's not their normal location, but it's a splinter population that occurs, and we call that genetic drift because now I had my original mainland population with now a small group that's been shifted to an island. Okay, and this will often be started by really, really small groups, and this is actually where the lab's going to come in, and we call this lab rats, and I love it. It's super fun. So the founder effect is one form of genetic drift, and this splinter population starts with a different allele frequency than the original, because having such a small group, it's by chance what is the actual gene pool of that little group, and that's what they begin with, and that's what then is going to drive the change down the road in their new environment. Population bottleneck is when you get a population complete crashing happens, and that's going to narrow your gene pool. So a volcano eruption, an earthquake, some sort of natural disaster. Who cares if you were great for the environment, but if you're just unlucky enough to be in the way of the lava, you're going to die. And so it's complete chance that grabs these particular populations, and the survivors now make up the new group, and that new group is then what sets the stage for the subsequent generations down the road. And then if we have non-random mating, if organisms are specifically selecting against other ones for mating purposes, that's going to influence change down the road. And we as humans do this with things like dogs and like racehorses and stuff like that. And we refer to that as sexual selection. Things like behavior, appearance, self-pollination barriers, all of those kinds of things try to prevent that from happening.